A father and son killed outside their rural home.
It's a bloodbath. The minute I open the car, I can smell a flammable liquid.
The house had been burglarized back in 2017.
This seemed to be a targeted attack.
Promising leads quickly unravel.
Their wallets were missing, but there was no burglary of the home. No broken windows, no kicked-in doors.
It was pretty obvious. Somebody wanted us to believe that it was a robbery.
When detectives track down the gunman, their investigation takes an unexpected turn, exposing a betrayal that leaves a close-knit Christian community in shock.
He said that he was hired to do the job.
There was a text message. She said, yes, that was sort of our code.
Do what? You really want to play stupid? I'm serious now.
She offered him $20,000 to commit that murder.
It didn't sound right to me. I was in complete shock. How could they possibly think that she had done this?
August 18th, 2018. It's just before noon in Horry County, South Carolina, and police are responding to reports of a burned-out vehicle abandoned in a soybean field.
It was unusual because, here's this car sitting in the middle of their field. They had no idea how it had gotten there.
All the doors were closed. It was obvious that the windows were covered in soot from the inside. So the initial officer that arrived opened the door just to see if anybody was inside. Nobody was in the vehicle, but somebody attempted to burn the vehicle.
He ran the license plate through dispatch, got the owner's name and address, and that was Robbie Ford.
They come up with an address roughly 15 to 17 miles away in Conway. They send an officer to the house. It's a residence owned by Mr. Robert Ford, Robbie's father.
The house is in the rural section of Horry County. It's mainly family farms. It's not very populated.
The officer goes there, knocks on the front door, gets no response, attempts to walk around to the back of the house.
He looked to his right and saw a male body laying outside the back door. He saw another male body laying on the grassy area.
The officer checks for signs of life, but both men are dead from apparent gunshot wounds. The older victim appears to be Robert Ford, and the younger one, his son Robbie.
They both shared the same name, Robbie, and then Robert's the dad. It's a bloodbath. Something really bad has happened.
The officer immediately called for assistance, homicide, supervisors, all hands on deck. There was no burglary of the home. The door was still locked when law enforcement got there. There was no broken windows, no kicked-in doors.
So investigators start asking themselves, is there something about either of these victims that would cause someone to target them? So they're really looking to who would have a motive to kill them.
Initial background checks show that Robert Marion Ford was born on May 21st, 1959, in Conway, South Carolina.
Robert was a native of the area, lifelong resident. He was very active in his church, very active in the choir.
He was married to a lady named Sheila. Sheila and Robert had a daughter named Samantha.
Samantha was always the apple of his eye. She had a great relationship with her dad. She loved both her parents very much.
The relationship between Robert and Sheila was strained. So they had gotten a divorce. They saw each other
from time to time, but it was a very chilled relationship.
Once he and Samantha's mother divorced, Robert quickly married Melda, who was Robbie's mother. So Samantha and Robbie were half siblings. It seemed as though the family was pretty close, pretty well adjusted. Samantha grew up with her mother, but would certainly visit with her father on a regular basis.
Robbie was always the typical annoying kid brother. Not that Samantha ever treated him like she was annoyed with him or anything. She spent time with him. She loved him.
As Samantha and Robbie got older, Robert worked hard to support them.
He had been a very hard worker, studiously saving money so that he could provide for his children.
Robert also invested in his children's spiritual growth.
He played leadership roles in the church. He was a constant member of the choir, and he went several times a week. So everyone in the community knew Robert, and they all knew Samantha. They all knew Robbie.
But Robert's devotion to the church was challenged when 21-year-old Samantha came to him with some difficult news.
She got pregnant out of wedlock. He wasn't happy about the situation, but he didn't fault her. But the church frowned upon it, even though she has been involved in the church her entire life. Her father had to step down as deacon because she's an unwed mother.
To Robert, the decision was simple. When Samantha gave birth to her daughter, he was there for her, despite the scandal it caused in the congregation.
He had a grandchild, so in ways their relationship was strengthened.
He was an amazing grandfather. He loved his kids. He's Pappy.
Within a few years, Samantha gave birth to twin boys, but her relationship with the children's father didn't last. However, when she met and married a man who worked at the nearby detention center, Samantha found the stability her children needed.
He had adopted her 3 biological children that she had from someone else. Samantha maybe did some work here or there, but nothing steady.
She was always involved with her children. She stayed at home a lot with the kids.
While Samantha settled into family life, Robbie was building a life of his own.
Robbie was also very highly thought of. He had been in school at Clemson studying for an architecture degree and seemed at least on the path to a good career.
He had a good relationship with his niece and nephews. Still had a really good relationship with Samantha. They talked regularly.
But in 2016, the family faced heartbreak when Robert's wife Melda suddenly died. Over the next 2 years, Robbie and Samantha became his support system as he dealt with the grief.
It was just Robbie and Robert living at the home when Robbie was not in college.
There were quite a number of text messages. They would spend time with each other, visit with each other. So at first blush, the family certainly seemed very close.
But on the evening of August 18th, 2018, both Robert and Robbie have been found shot to death outside their home. Shortly after the discovery, Detective Peter Sester arrives to begin an investigation.
We've got a young male. He has what appears to be a gunshot wound in his upper right shoulder and a gunshot wound to the back of the head. The second victim, and that would be Robbie's father, Robert Ford. His gunshot wound is a contact wound under the chin. They had some to-go cups with them, maybe some leftover food or something in a bag with them. So they are just peacefully coming in. You begin to think, okay, Robert Ford had to have been shot first because there is no indication of a struggle. That tells me the suspect's standing right there and waiting for them. Robbie Ford is probably attempting to flee from the back of the house when he's shot more than likely in the upper right shoulder first. That puts him to the ground. The second shot is then the suspect coming up behind him and shooting him in the back of the head. At close range, you could see that blood is coagulating. It's beginning to turn darker. I've got to assume it's probably anywhere from 6 to 12 hours earlier that this occurred. Both of the wallets were gone. One of the cars is in the driveway, and obviously the other vehicle that's in the farming field belongs to this residence.
A robbery attempt seems possible, but a search of the home quickly dismisses that theory.
The neighbors were probably about 2 football fields away. This seemed to be a targeted attack in part because someone went specifically to that location in a very rural area. That suggests that they had some knowledge of who lived there or what they might find there.
Both of these two individuals are quiet, law-abiding citizens. The father is a good church-going man, and Robbie's looking forward to going off to school in Charleston. The fact that the father is shot up close and personal, you can't help but think this is a close friend or a relative that's behind this murder.
The initial questions would be, do they have any enemies? Who would want to do this? Who gains from their death?
Coming up, detectives get a lead from something the killer left behind.
Cigarette butts are a perfect source of DNA.
And an insight into the killer's mindset is revealed.
A mask shows that this was not spur of the moment. This was planned out.
To South Carolina police, the murders of 59-year-old Robert Ford and his 25-year-old son Robbie Ford appear to be the result of a targeted attack. But it seems the killer tried to make it look otherwise.
Their wallets were missing. Robbie's vehicle was missing. But it looks like a homicide made to look like a robbery gone bad.
This crime appears to be committed solely on these two individuals. That's telling us that we need to be looking for somebody that may be closely connected to these victims.
News of something happening at the Ford home gets back to loved ones quickly.
Samantha did show up at the scene. It's my understanding that people had called to tell her there was a law enforcement presence at her father and brother's house.
She approached law enforcement. They told her your father and half-brother had been killed.
She seemed pretty shocked about the whole incident. Kind of a normal reaction you would expect from a daughter.
They began asking, when's the last time you heard from them? Do you know what they had been doing recently? And Samantha told investigators that Robert and Robbie had been down in Charleston looking for an apartment for Robbie, who was going to be spending a semester of school down there.
She communicated with them the night before and knew that they would be arriving back on Saturday.
She described her relationship with her father as an excellent relationship. They were very close. She would go and clean his house, bring them meals. She could not think of anyone who would want to harm either her father or her brother.
According to Samantha, the only trouble her father had in the recent past is a break-in.
The house had been burglarized back in 2017, and several items had been taken from the house at that time.
During that burglary, a .38 revolver was stolen, some jewelry, and a laptop.
To investigators, it seems unlikely the burglars would return a year later and not steal anything. They leave Samantha to grieve and make arrangements to follow up with her.
They canvassed the neighborhood and they went to one of the closest neighbors who was kind of across the field. The night before, around 8:45, that neighbor was outside in his yard and heard a gunshot, followed by a scream and another gunshot. He didn't report that to the police at the time because in that area of our county, hearing gunshots is not particularly unusual.
The timing corresponds to what Samantha told investigators. Detective Sestaire directs his attention to the soybean field where Robert's car was abandoned.
This is significant because whoever brought that vehicle there decided that they were going to try and destroy evidence by setting the vehicle on fire. I arrive on scene. You're looking for any type of evidence. I find nothing until I get within about 5 to 10 feet of the vehicle. And just outside the driver's door of the vehicle on the ground, there are 3 cigarette butts that are smoked down almost to the filter. The minute I open the car, I can smell a flammable liquid, gasoline or something of that nature. I also see inside the vehicle, that I think is significant, is on the driver's side floor, there's like a wool ski cap.
When people set out to burn a car, they don't realize that the car has to have a lot of oxygen to continue the burn.
The killer, he didn't roll any windows down or crack a window, so the fire quickly smothered.
Detective Sestaire collects the pieces of evidence and reseals the car to preserve the crime scene.
Cigarette butts are a perfect source of DNA. Skin cells, saliva from your mouth is on the filters of those cigarettes. So that's going to definitely yield a significant profile for us on who our killer may be.
While the crime lab begins analysis of the DNA samples, investigators consider the other evidence left behind.
A mask shows that this was not spur of the moment. This was planned out.
With the investigation underway, the shocking news spreads across the small community.
Robert Ford's family was horrified that he had been murdered and really wanted some justice.
Samantha was completely devastated. She didn't even know, up from down at that moment. They told her they couldn't rule her out at that point. We just assumed that was typical protocol.
But when investigators contact Samantha to give a statement, she provides an airtight alibi.
There was a convenience store that showed Samantha on surveillance video during the time of the murders. The investigators also got Samantha's phone records. There was no evidence that her phone was using a cell tower near her father's home.
A few weeks later, the DNA samples collected from the burned vehicle provide detectives with a possible new lead.
The State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, determines that both the cigarette butts and the skull cap had the same single source DNA profile. That's like gold in an investigation because it's one person.
I vividly remember there was celebration. We don't know everything, but we fully expected the killer to be in CODIS.
It's been 30 days since the murders of Robert and Robbie Ford, and Horry County investigators have just gotten a huge break in the case.
The DNA profile is that of a white male. We're excited. We're thinking the minute they load that thing into CODIS, we're going to get a hit. You know, this person's got to be in there.
Unfortunately, CODIS did not come back with what we call a hit, so it didn't lead anywhere at that point.
But we now have that it is a white male.
Experts suggest detectives send the samples to a company specializing in ancestral DNA.
You can't DNA everybody. It's a violation of people's privacy. But we'll pay ourselves to send our DNA into 23andMe and all these other companies. Well, the one thing they don't tell you when you sent your DNA off through the mail is through forensic genealogy, law enforcement can have access to it.
That takes time. It was a lot of hard investigative work that went into this, patience, and the longer it takes you, the fear of memories, of evidence, of things happening to people that they're not going to be around later on.
As the months pass, Samantha Rabon moves on with her life.
I had gone to her home, which was formerly her father's home. Her and her husband and her kids moved into it.
Samantha Rabon acted pretty quickly in laying claim to Robert's assets and to any money that was available to her. And I think that certainly got investigators' attention, that she was behaving so quickly. Police found out from Robert Ford's sister that he had insurance policies and that Samantha Rabon was the beneficiary of those policies. But Robbie was actually the primary beneficiary.
Robert had a lot of insurance, and he had a lot of land. So if anything were to happen to Robert, Robbie would get that money.
I know that afterwards she was obtaining money from various insurance policies after her dad and brother had been murdered, and she was renovating her home. So she was benefiting from her father and brother's death for sure.
In August 2020, 2 years after the murders, the DNA lab contacts detectives.
They come back with a partial match. Our suspect has 2 other brothers, and that's great information. And they're both incarcerated, so their DNA was collected in jail. Problem is, they weren't out of jail, so it's definitely not them. But from that, we then develop a potential suspect, and that's Randy Granger. Turns out that he has a criminal history. He had been in prison for, I believe, about 15 years.
Data obtained from the cell tower near the burned vehicle puts Randy in the area when the crime took place.
They discovered a phone number associated with Randy Granger as making a phone call to somebody else on this night. And that phone number came back to a woman named Teresa Martin. Randy Granger and Teresa Martin were dating, boyfriend and girlfriend. Teresa Martin, once investigators start looking into her, is discovered to be a distant relative of Samantha Rabon's mother. She is a cousin. Of course, it raises eyebrows that Randy Granger, whose DNA is at the soybean field, is calling the cousin of Samantha Rabon on the night that her father and her brother have been murdered.
Coming up, a co-conspirator makes a confession.
When he was done with the job, she gave him $20,000.
And exposes the puppet master.
He said that he was hired
To do what?
to kill her daddy.
Nearly 2 years after Robert Ford and his son Robbie Ford were found murdered, South Carolina police interview 2 new suspects. A relative of Samantha Rabon, Teresa Martin, and Teresa's boyfriend, 50-year-old Randy Granger.
They're brought in and placed in separate rooms and questioned.
We know he was involved. So even at that point, we've got to get a story as to why this happened. Going into it, it's like, what is your connection with these 2?
Randy is confronted with photos of the burned vehicle and items containing his DNA.
Mr. Randy, do you have any idea why you're here? No? What's that?
It's a Ford Escape.
You ain't never seen it? You ain't never seen it before?
No.
Okay.
It's a cigarette book with DNA on it. It was left right beside the car.
Randy wouldn't say anything about anything.
I know you didn't do this by yourself, but I want as the person who asked you to do it. Do what? You really want to play stupid? I'm serious now. Because I got you right now for at least 2 counts of murder, arson. You need a lawyer, I guess.
Hitting a brick wall with Randy, detectives hope Teresa will give them more.
Just because you know something doesn't mean you're involved in it, doesn't mean you can be in trouble for it. But by lying to us, that's where a problem comes. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
At first, Teresa sidesteps their questions about Randy, but she eventually admits he called her to pick him up on the day of the murders.
And what did he say?
Nothing. He just got in the car and he said, let's go home.
As police continued to interview her, she engaged in what we call progressive truth-telling. She kept giving them just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more.
He said that he was hired to do a job.
And he said, who hired him?
He said Samantha.
To do what?
To kill her daddy.
Okay.
About a week before the murders, Teresa says she overheard Randy and Samantha discussing the plan.
She told him that, like I said, she had a job for him to do, and I wanted to take care of my daddy and my brother. When he was done with the job, she'd give him $20,000. And she wanted it done before he left to go to college, because she knew if just her daddy got killed, then she would have to split everything.
Robbie was actually the primary beneficiary, so it wouldn't have done Samantha much good to kill her father if her brother didn't die at the same time.
Then she is the sole beneficiary of all assets. Those assets include pension plans, life insurance, lots of acreage that her father's home was on, including the home, all these assets up to almost $1 million.
So how did he get to Robert's house?
Well, I took him and dropped him off. He told me that he got the gun from Samantha. He said he's been waiting in the woods until they come home.
You remember what time?
It wasn't dark yet.
There was a text message from Teresa Martin to Samantha Rabon, "I'm home alone." They confronted her with that. At first, she denied that it meant anything. Eventually, she said, yes, that was sort of our code, that I had dropped Randy off.
The interview gives detectives what they need to secure an arrest warrant for Samantha. She is immediately arrested at her mother's residence.
They actually timed Samantha's arrest for the 2-year anniversary of the murders. Samantha Rabon was initially charged with murder and criminal conspiracy.
News of the alleged murder plot stuns everyone in the community.
I heard all these rumors, but I took it with a grain of salt because it didn't sound right to me. This is not the young lady that I've grown to know.
I was in complete shock when they arrested her. How could they possibly think that she had done this?
Once Samantha's arrested, she doesn't talk. She doesn't claim to be involved in any way, shape, form, or fashion.
Before I ask you any questions, just want you to know, I already talked to Randy. And Randy's in jail. Okay? Do you want to talk to us?
No. So how does my lawyer come here? Like, what happened to them?
Now with a warrant, police obtain Samantha's cell phone. Investigators turn it over to a detective who specializes in electronic crimes.
I deal with anything that has digital evidence. I got the cell phone. I began using keyword searches and searching for insurance. I began murder and different search criterias to go through the device.
Some of the more interesting web searches were how quickly you can clean up a double homicide. How quickly can you get a passport?
There were other searches. Does God forgive murderers? Can you be a suspect in a murder and never get charged?
There is a lot of real damning search history that really feeds in to the fact that she has played a significant role in the death of her father and her brother.
After 2 years of investigation, Samantha Rabon has been charged with plotting a murder for hire to get rid of her father and brother. Once the case is handed over to prosecutors, they focus on getting Samantha's co-conspirators to turn against her.
Teresa Martin had basically admitted some of her involvement, and she quickly agreed to cooperate. Randy Granger would not, so I determined that it was easier to try him first.
On April 3rd, 2023, Teresa pleads guilty to being an accessory.
Teresa Martin never goes to trial, takes a plea, and agrees to testify in both Randy and Samantha Rabon's trials.
The same day she takes a plea, she provides witness testimony at Randy's trial.
The police get what we call a buccal swab, a known DNA standard from him. That DNA standard is sent to SLED, and SLED is able to say, yes, that DNA standard matches the single-source DNA profile from the cigarette butts and the ski cap at the scene.
Randy Granger is found guilty and sentenced to 2 life terms for the murder of Robert and Robbie Ford.
After his conviction of 2 counts of murder, arson, and other charges, Randy has a change of heart.
Randy, at that point, agreed to testify against Samantha Rabon.
According to Randy, Samantha's relationships with her father and brother weren't as rosy as police had been led to believe.
Samantha was the child of a previous marriage, whereas Robbie had grown up with both of his parents in the same home. So I think there was a little bit of tension there because Robbie may have been perceived as being the favored child in the family dynamic.
There was talk about Samantha being unhappy about Robbie maybe getting a little more inheritance than she did.
Randy says Samantha approached him at her mother's house with a plan to profit off their deaths.
Randy Granger said that Samantha Rabon gave him the gun that day on the porch. She said that they both had to die at the same time, and she offered him $20,000 to commit that murder.
About a week later, Randy and Teresa executed the plan.
Teresa Martin dropped Randy off at Robert and Robbie Ford's home. Randy Granger waited hours and hours and smoked cigarettes while he was waiting for them to come home. He knew that they were going to be at dinner. He just didn't know exactly when they would get home.
Around 8:45 p.m., he heard tires on the gravel driveway.
Robert got out of the passenger side of Robbie's car first and was walking to go up the back steps to his home. And he shot Robert Ford in the face. Randy says he hears Robbie scream, and he is running, and so he shoots Robbie in the back. And then he goes over and shoots Robbie in the back of the head. He walks back over to Robert and shoots him under his chin. And he takes their wallets, and he takes the keys to the Ford Escape that was Robbie's. And he drives it to a field, and he attempts to burn it.
Once the car was on fire, Randy called Teresa to pick him up. But he'd made a few crucial mistakes.
He had smoked basically a pack of cigarettes, and then he put the cigarettes in his socks to keep from leaving evidence there.
He didn't realize that his socks had rolled down and the cigarettes he'd been stashing from Robert's house had fallen outside the car onto the ground. And he thought that the skull cap would have burned up, but they didn't.
The intent was to completely destroy the vehicle. He just neglected to leave a window open to allow oxygen to get into it.
After the double homicide, Randy found out it was all for nothing.
He never received $20,000 from Samantha Rabon. Randy was upset at first, but you can't call the police.
With Randy and Teresa's help, prosecutors believe they have enough to convict Samantha. But they know when it comes to juries, a guilty verdict is never certain.
I think the strongest thing that we had going for us was a clear motive. But anytime you are dependent on a testifying co-defendant, you always worry because it's very easy cross-examination for the defense attorney. Well, you're doing this to get a better deal. They have a built-in motive to fabricate. So there was a lot of pressure on us to get the right result.
On February 21st, 2024, Samantha Rabon stands trial for the murders of her family members, Robert and Robbie Ford.
It was a full 6 years after we discovered that gruesome scene off Highway 19, so way past due.
For Samantha's trial, the whole victim side of the courtroom was packed with family, with friends. There were still some supporters for Samantha Rabon on her side, including her husband and some other family members.
Prosecutors rely heavily on Randy Granger's testimony.
I will say I thought Randy's testimony was extremely effective. It had a ring of truth to it that you couldn't deny.
They argue the burglary at the Ford home, during which the murder weapon was stolen, is evidence of premeditation.
It does seem that Samantha Rabon was certainly responsible for that burglary, which shows us that she had been thinking about having her father killed and her brother killed for at least a year before and was actually going to use her father's own gun to do it.
Samantha finally reached a breaking point. Her income was not meeting her outgo, and I think she snapped because there was a solution And that solution to make her a millionaire was going to cost her her dad and her brother.
Samantha's defense team attempts to undermine Randy's credibility.
The defense, of course, is going to paint a cooperating state's witness, a man that admits to pulling the trigger, as not to be trusted.
Randy Granger did tell us what he had done with the gun. He said that he threw it into sort of a creek running along a road, but we were never able to find the gun.
Samantha Rabon was adamant that she didn't do it, and that just because she benefited, I'm sure she probably thought that doesn't mean I'm a murderer.
On February 28, 2024, after 2 hours, the jury reaches a decision.
When he said that she was guilty, inside I was screaming and crying and having a complete breakdown.
She was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole and was taken away that day.
I still don't understand. I'm just still so overwhelmed and lost in the feeling of there's no true factual evidence that I can see.
100% justice was served. She is the one that set this plan in motion, and she is where she belongs.
Although the gunman, Randy Granger, helped prosecutors convict Samantha, he doesn't fare much better.
The state filed a motion asking a judge to allow him to be resentenced, but the judge only turned it from 2 consecutive life terms to 2 concurrent life terms, so not much of a break for him in the end.
I know there was a huge sense of relief for Robert's family and for that community where Robert lived. He was extremely active in his church and had a lot of friends out there, and I think they were relieved to finally see some justice in this case.
Who would want to think that anyone in their family would have the ability to draft up a plan like this, to have somebody executed simply over money? Samantha felt she needed it all. Greed got the better end of her.
The rain in Vancouver has a way of changing the mood of the city. It falls softly over the streets, turning sidewalks into mirrors, washing over buildings that stand crowded together, hiding the cracks and shadows that exist beneath the surface. For many people, Vancouver is known as one of the most beautiful cities in Canada, a place surrounded by mountains, ocean, and endless natural beauty. But there is another side of Vancouver, a side that existed far away from the postcards and tourist images. A side where forgotten lives struggle to survive. In the heart of the city, in the downtown east side, a neighborhood filled with poverty, addiction, and desperation, a frightening pattern began to emerge. Women who were familiar faces on the streets started disappearing. At first, each disappearance seemed like an isolated tragedy. A woman who did not come home, a friend who stopped answering calls, a daughter whose family waited for a return that never came. But slowly, the numbers began to grow. One woman disappeared, then another, then another. Their names became part of missing persons reports. Their faces appeared on posters. Their families searched through memories, hoping for some small clue that could explain where they had gone. But years passed, and many questions remained unanswered. Who had taken them? Where had they gone? And why did it seem like nobody was listening? These women were often among the most vulnerable people in society. Many struggled with addiction. Some worked on the streets. Some had complicated lives, filled with hardships that made them easier for the world to ignore. And that became one of the most disturbing parts of a story, because the victims were not invisible. They were mothers. They were daughters. They were sisters. They were friends. They had childhood memories. They had dreams. They had people who loved them. But somewhere along the way, their disappearances became background noise in a city that was too busy looking away. Meanwhile, not far from Vancouver, in the quiet city of Port Coquitlam, there was a man living a life that appeared ordinary. His name was Robert William Picton. To people who knew him casually, Picton was not someone who seemed dangerous. He was not a man who attracted attention. He was quiet, unusual, and sometimes described as socially awkward. He lived on a large farm property with his family, working around animals and machinery. The property was not a dark, abandoned place hidden in the wilderness. It was a real working farm, surrounded by ordinary communities where neighbors lived their everyday lives. People drove past it. People knew the family. People saw activity there. And yet, behind the gates of that farm, investigators would later uncover one of the darkest criminal mysteries in Canadian history. The place that appeared normal would become connected to a nightmare. For years, Robert Picton continued his life while investigators struggled to connect the missing women from Vancouver's downtown east side to one single person. There was no dramatic moment when the truth suddenly became obvious. There was no single clue that immediately revealed everything. Instead, the case developed slowly, piece by piece, through years of unanswered questions, missed opportunities, and families demanding justice. The first signs of suspicion came when a woman survived an attack connected to Picton's property in the late 1990s. She escaped with injuries and reported what happened. It was a moment that could have changed everything. A moment that could have exposed what was happening before more lives were lost. But the investigation did not immediately become the breakthrough authorities needed. The years continued, the disappearances continued, and somewhere in the background, the possibility remained that a predator was operating while the world searched for answers. Then came February 2002. A police investigation led officers to the Picton farm. At first, it was not expected to become one of the largest forensic investigations Canada had ever seen. But when investigators entered the property, they discovered evidence that transformed the case completely. The farm was no longer just a piece of land. It became a crime scene, a place where investigators believed they might finally uncover the truth behind years of missing women. The search became enormous. Teams of forensic specialists arrived. Every area of the property was examined. The ground itself became evidence. Investigators searched through soil, buildings, and countless objects, looking for traces that could reveal what happened to the women who vanished. Each piece of evidence carried the weight of a family's unanswered questions. Each discovery represented another possible story of a life interrupted. As the investigation expanded, Robert Picton became the center of one of the most shocking criminal cases Canada had ever witnessed. The allegations were horrifying. Prosecutors would later argue that Picton targeted women who were already struggling, women who he believed would not immediately be noticed when they disappeared. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. A man living an ordinary life, a farm that appeared ordinary, and a series of disappearances that were anything but ordinary. The tragedy was not only about what happened inside the walls of that property. It was also about how long the warning signs existed before the truth was uncovered. For the families of the missing women, the investigation brought painful answers, but also years of grief. They had spent years wondering, years hoping, years asking the same question. Where are they? The name Robert Picton would eventually become known around the world, but behind that name were the stories of women whose lives mattered long before they became part of a criminal investigation. Their stories did not begin with their disappearance. They began with birthdays, childhoods, friendships, struggles, and dreams. They were people. And before understanding the darkness that surrounded this case, it is important to remember the lives that existed before the tragedy. Because this story is not only about a man accused of unimaginable crimes. It is about the people who were lost. It is about the families who waited. And it is about how silence, when ignored for too long, can allow darkness to grow. The setting. To understand how a tragedy of this magnitude could happen, we have to go back and look at the world where it began. Before the headlines, before the police investigations, before the name Robert Picton became associated with one of Canada's darkest criminal cases, there was a city with two very different realities existing side by side. Vancouver was a place of incredible beauty, a city where mountains rose behind the skyline, where the ocean surrounded the coastline, and where people came from around the world searching for opportunity and a better life. But only a few streets away from the image of a perfect Canadian city was a neighborhood carrying years of pain. The downtown east side was one of the poorest communities in Canada. The streets were filled with people fighting battles that many outside the neighborhood never saw. Addiction, poverty, homelessness, mental health struggles, and trauma shaped the daily lives of thousands. The area was complicated. It was not simply a place of darkness. It was also a community filled with people who cared for each other, people who looked after their neighbors, people who knew each other's stories. But it was also a place where vulnerable people could disappear without creating the same urgency that might surround someone from a different background. Many of the women who went missing from this area lived lives that were already difficult. They were often fighting battles that had started years before anyone knew their names. Some had lost contact with family. Some struggled to survive from one day to the next. Some carried painful histories that followed them everywhere. And when they disappeared, their absence was sometimes treated as another sad event in a neighborhood already filled with suffering. That became one of the most painful questions surrounding the case. How many people had to disappear before someone truly listened? Not far away from the chaos of downtown East Side was a completely different environment. Port Coquitlam was a quieter community located outside Vancouver. It was a place of residential streets, family homes, and farmland. The pace of life was slower. Neighbors recognized each other. People expected the world around them to be predictable. And on a large property, there lived Robert William Picton. Born in 1949, Picton grew up around farming. His family operated a large farm, and from the outside, the lifestyle appeared ordinary. He was not someone who seemed like a person capable of becoming the center of a criminal investigation that would shock the nation. People who knew him described him as strange at times, someone who kept to himself, someone who did not always fit easily into social situations. He was not the kind of person most people would immediately fear. And that was part of what made the case so disturbing. The most dangerous people are not always the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes they blend into the background. Sometimes they become familiar. Sometimes people pass them every day without ever imagining what may be hidden behind closed doors. The Picton property itself became a symbol of that contradiction. It was a farm, a place with animals, buildings, equipment, and the ordinary signs of rural life. But years later, investigators would walk across that same land searching for answers to questions that families had been asking for years. The farm was large, complicated, and filled with areas that could hide evidence. It was not a simple crime scene. It became an enormous challenge for investigators who had to carefully examine every part of the property. But before that happened, the disappearances continued. Throughout the 1990s, women from downtown East Side vanished one by one. Their friends noticed. Their families noticed. People in the community noticed. There were conversations on the streets. There were questions among those who knew the missing women personally. People wondered if the disappearances were connected. They wondered if someone was targeting them. But connecting those disappearances into one investigation would take years. At the center of the tragedy was a painful reality. Many of these women were already living on society's margins. Their struggles made them easier to overlook. Their disappearances did not always receive immediate attention. The families who searched for them often felt like they were fighting a system that did not understand how serious the situation was. They were not searching for statistics. They were searching for people they loved. A mother waiting for a daughter to call. A friend hoping someone would walk through the door again. A family member refusing to believe that silence meant the worst. Meanwhile, Robert Picton continued living his life. He remained connected to the farm. He moved through the world as someone who appeared ordinary. And that contrast became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. How could someone accused of such horrific crimes exist for so long without being discovered? How could so many warning signs appear without creating immediate action? The answer would later become a painful examination of missed opportunities, social inequality, and the way society responds to people who are often ignored. The investigation into the missing women was not only about finding a suspect. It was about uncovering the truth of what happened to those who vanished. It was about giving identities back to victims who had been reduced to names on paperwork. And it was about confronting a reality many people did not want to face. The victims were not just missing women from a troubled neighborhood. They were human beings whose lives had value. Their stories existed long before their disappearances. And their stories would become the heart of a case that would change Canada forever. Fan 3, The Victim Story. Before the world knew the name Robert Picton, Before the quiet farmland in Port Coquitlam became connected to one of the darkest criminal investigations in Canadian history, there were dozens of women whose lives were already filled with struggles, dreams, mistakes, hopes, and moments of happiness that had nothing to do with the tragedy waiting ahead. They were not just missing persons reports. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, and human beings who had stories long before their names appeared in police files. For years, many of them lived in Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood known for poverty, addiction, homelessness, and desperation. It was a place where people could disappear into the crowd. The streets were busy, but many of the people walking through them felt invisible. The women who lived there often carried wounds that others could not see. Some had experienced childhood trauma. Some struggled with addiction. Some had been pushed away from their families. Some were trying to survive one more day in an environment where danger could appear anywhere. But behind every difficult chapter was a person who once had dreams. A person who laughed. A person who loved. A person who mattered. One of those women was Georgina Papine. Georgina was known by people close to her as someone with a strong personality. Like many women in the downtown east side, her life had been complicated, but those who knew her remembered more than her struggles. They remembered a woman who had a presence, someone who could make people smile, someone who was part of a community that cared about her. Her disappearance did not happen in a dramatic moment that immediately captured national attention. There was no sudden nationwide alarm, no massive public search in the early days. Instead, her absence became another unanswered question among many. For her family and friends, however, there was nothing ordinary about it. When someone disappears, the world around them changes. A phone that never rings, a chair that stays empty, a familiar face that never appears again. The uncertainty can become its own kind of suffering because there is no goodbye, no explanation, no moment where a person can understand what happened. The same pain was experienced by the family of Serena Abotsway. Serena was a young woman whose life had been shaped by hardship, but also by relationships and people who cared about her. Those close to her described someone who had a warm side, someone who wanted connection and acceptance. Like many others who vanished from the downtown east side, Serena was living in circumstances that made her vulnerable. Her disappearance was devastating to those who knew her, but as the years passed, her case became part of a much larger pattern that investigators initially failed to fully recognize. The names continued: Mona Wilson, Andrea Joesbury, Brenda and Wolfe, Marnie Fry. Each woman represented a different life story, a different family history, and a different set of people who hoped that one day they would receive answers. Mona Wilson was remembered by people around her as someone with her own personality, someone who had relationships and connections. She was not defined by the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. She was a person who existed beyond the headlines that would eventually follow. Andrea Joesbury's disappearance left behind people who questioned what had happened and why there seemed to be so few answers. For those waiting, time did not make the pain disappear. It only stretched the uncertainty longer. Brenda and Wolfe was another woman whose name would later become permanently connected to the investigation. But before investigators searched fields and examined evidence, she was simply Brenda, a woman with memories, experiences, and people who knew her. Marnie Fry was also among the women whose disappearance became part of a devastating pattern. Like the others, she had a life before tragedy. She had moments that mattered, even if the world later reduced her story to a crime statistic. The tragedy of the Picton case is not only found in what happened at the farm. It is also found in the years before the truth was discovered. The years when families searched. The years when people asked questions. The years when some felt that their loved ones were not receiving the attention they deserved. Many critics later argued that these women were overlooked because of who they were and where they lived. Their struggles with addiction, poverty, or sex work became barriers that affected how quickly authorities responded. For families, this was one of the most painful parts of the story. They did not see their loved ones as problems. They saw them as people. A mother did not see a daughter's addiction before she saw her child. A friend did not see a woman's mistakes before she saw the person who shared memories with them. A sister did not see a person's circumstances before she saw someone she loved. The women who disappeared from Vancouver's downtown east side were often living on the edge of society, but their lives were not without value. They had childhood memories. They had favorite songs. They had jokes only their friends understood. They had people who would have welcomed them home. The contrast between their lives and the place where investigators eventually believed they ended up was horrifying. On one side was the ordinary world they came from: apartments, streets, friendships, conversations, and daily survival. On the other side was the isolated farmland where authorities would later uncover evidence suggesting that many of their stories ended. The distance between Vancouver and Port Coquitlam was not enormous. It was close enough that someone could travel there and return without attracting immediate suspicion. That ordinary distance became part of what made the case so disturbing. A person could disappear from one community and become hidden inside another. Robert Pickton did not initially appear to the world as a monster. He was not someone who stood out immediately. He lived a relatively quiet life. He worked around his family's farm. He interacted with people in the area. That normal appearance would later become one of the most chilling aspects of the investigation. Because the victims were vulnerable, and because Pickton appeared ordinary, the danger remained hidden for years. But the women themselves were never ordinary. They were people whose lives were interrupted. People whose families carried unanswered questions. People whose stories deserved to be heard. As investigators eventually pieced together the timeline, they discovered that these disappearances were not isolated events. They were connected by a pattern that had been developing quietly for years. The missing women had something in common. They had crossed paths with a man who would later be accused of exploiting exactly what made them vulnerable: their trust, their desperation, their need for help. The investigation would eventually focus on Robert Pickton, but the heart of the story would always belong to the women who were lost. Because every criminal case is evidence, suspects, and courtrooms. But before all of that, there are lives, and those lives cannot be reduced to a list of names. The women connected to the Pickton investigation came from different backgrounds, but they shared one thing above everything else. They were human beings who deserved to be found. They were human beings whose families deserved the truth. And for years, the truth remained hidden, waiting beneath the surface of a quiet farm where no one imagined that something so terrible could be taking place. Fan 4, the incident. For years, the disappearances from Vancouver's downtown east side remained scattered pieces of a puzzle that no one could fully understand. A woman vanished. A family searched. A friend wondered. A police report was filed. And then another woman disappeared. At first, there was no single moment when everything became clear. There was no dramatic revelation that immediately exposed the truth. Instead, the horror grew slowly, hidden beneath years of unanswered questions and missed connections. Somewhere between the crowded streets of Vancouver and the quiet roads leading toward Port Coquitlam, a pattern was forming. And at the center of that pattern was a place that looked ordinary from the outside. A farm. The Pickton property was not a dark, abandoned location hidden away from civilization. It was a working farm surrounded by other properties, a place where people came and went. The land had been part of the community for years. But behind the gates, and beyond the areas most people saw, investigators would later believe that something terrifying had taken place. Robert William Pickton had access to isolation. He had access to land. And he had access to women who were already struggling to be heard. The women from the downtown east side often lived unpredictable lives. Many were dealing with addiction, financial instability, or personal crises. Some moved frequently. Some had little contact with their families. Some had relationships that came and went. Those circumstances created a devastating vulnerability. When they disappeared, there were fewer immediate answers, fewer people asking questions, fewer people demanding attention. For someone looking to hide a crime, that vulnerability could become an opportunity. During the years when women were disappearing, Pickton continued living a life that appeared ordinary to many people around him. He was known as a man who worked on his farm, a man who kept to himself, a man who did not attract much attention. Neighbors did not look at him and immediately see danger. He did not fit the image many people imagine when they think of a violent criminal. That was part of what made the case so disturbing. The person accused of committing unimaginable crimes was someone who existed in plain sight. The first major warning signs appeared years before the final investigation. In 1997, a woman named Wendy Lynn Eistetter went to Pickton's farm. What happened there became one of the earliest incidents that drew law enforcement attention toward him. Eistetter survived. She later reported that she had been attacked and injured. During the confrontation, she managed to fight back, and police became involved. A knife wound was involved. Picton was arrested. At that moment, there was an opportunity to look deeper into what might have been happening. But the investigation did not uncover the full picture. The case moved forward, but it did not become the turning point that many would later wonder about. The years continued, and more women disappeared. Inside the downtown East Side, concern grew among people who knew the missing women. Some noticed that too many names were being added to the list. Too many familiar faces were gone. Too many stories ended without explanation. Families struggled with uncertainty. They wondered if their loved ones were still alive somewhere. They wondered if they had left voluntarily. They wondered if something much darker had happened. For some, the waiting became unbearable. The hardest part of losing someone without answers is that grief has no clear beginning. There is no funeral, no final gudbje, only questions. The missing women were caught between two worlds. To some, they were statistics. To others, they were everything. Their families refused to forget them. Their friends continued to speak their names. But while people searched for answers, the farm in Port Coquitlam remained. And inside that property, investigators would later discover evidence that suggested the disappearances were connected. The exact timeline of what happened to each victim was difficult to reconstruct. The evidence was complicated. The investigation was massive, but prosecutors would later argue that Picton had developed a method, a pattern, a way of targeting women who were unlikely to be immediately noticed when they vanished. The women were not random strangers without identities. They were people whose lives intersected with his. They were people who entered his world, and according to investigators, they did not leave. As the years passed, the number of missing women connected to the downtown East Side continued to grow. The community became increasingly frustrated. People questioned why more was not being done, why so many disappearances had not created a stronger response, why the women who were missing did not seem to receive the same urgency that others might have received. Their families felt ignored. Their advocates demanded answers. The fear was no longer only about individual disappearances. It was about the possibility that something much larger was happening. The investigation that eventually followed would reveal one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Canadian history. But before the search warrants, before the forensic teams, before the courtroom battles, there were years of uncertainty. Years when a mother looked at a photograph of her daughter and wondered where she was. Years when a friend walked through familiar streets hoping to see someone who had vanished. Years when people believed they might still receive a phone call, a knock on the door, a message saying everything had been a misunderstanding. But the reality was far more tragic. In February 2002, police finally entered the Picton property during an investigation that was initially focused on something unrelated. They were looking into illegal weapons. They expected to find evidence connected to that case. Instead, they discovered something that would change everything. Inside the farm were items belonging to missing women. Personal belongings. Evidence that suggested the disappearances were connected to that property. What began as a search became the beginning of a massive homicide investigation. The farm was transformed from a private piece of land into one of the largest forensic crime scenes Canada had ever seen. Investigators knew immediately that this would not be a simple case. The property was enormous. The evidence was buried, hidden, scattered. Every area had to be examined carefully. Every object had to be considered. Every possible connection had to be investigated. The search continued for months. Specialists arrived. Forensic experts worked through the land. The investigation expanded beyond what anyone initially imagined. The question was no longer whether women had disappeared. The question became how many had been lost. And who was responsible? Robert Picton was arrested. The quiet man from the farm was suddenly at the center of an investigation that shocked the country. The accusations against him were horrifying. Authorities believed that the property had been the final destination for many women who had gone missing from Vancouver. The families who had spent years waiting for answers were finally facing the truth they had feared. Their loved ones were not simply missing. They had been victims. The discovery did not bring relief. Not completely, because knowing the truth does not erase the pain. It does not bring someone back. It does not replace the years lost searching. It only changes uncertainty into grief. As the investigation continued, Canada was forced to confront uncomfortable questions, not only about Robert Pickton, but about the system that allowed so many women to disappear before the full danger was recognized. The story was no longer only about a man and a farm. It was about the lives of women who had been overlooked. It was about families who refused to stop searching. And it was about a terrible truth hidden for years in a place that looked ordinary to everyone passing by. Fan 5, The Discovery. For years, the disappearances remained like shadows hanging over Vancouver's downtown east side. Families waited. Friends searched. Advocates demanded answers. But the truth remained hidden. The women who vanished seemed to disappear into a gap between the lives that society noticed and the lives that society ignored. Each missing person report represented a human being, but as the years passed, the number of names continued to grow without a clear explanation. Then came the moment when everything changed. A quiet farm in Port Coquitlam, a place that had existed for years without attracting national attention, suddenly became the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Canadian history. The property belonged to Robert William Pickton. To outsiders, it was simply a rural piece of land. A place with buildings, equipment, and the ordinary signs of farm life. But when investigators entered the property in February 2002, they were not prepared for what they were about to uncover. The search began because of a different investigation. Police were looking into illegal weapons connected to Pickton. At the time, no one knew that this search would open the door to a much larger mystery. Investigators arrived expecting to examine a limited number of items. Instead, they found evidence that pointed toward something much darker. Inside the property were personal belongings connected to women who had been reported missing from Vancouver's downtown east side. Objects that belonged to people who had families waiting for them. Objects that suggested these disappearances were not isolated incidents. The discovery changed the entire direction of the investigation. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether women had disappeared. The question became what had happened to them, and how many lives had been lost. The scale of the property created an enormous challenge. The Pickton farm was not a small location that investigators could quickly search and leave behind. It was a large, complicated environment filled with countless areas that needed examination. Every corner mattered. Every piece of evidence could hold a clue. The investigation became a race against time to uncover the truth buried beneath years of uncertainty. Forensic teams were brought in. Specialists examined the land. Investigators carefully collected evidence, knowing that even the smallest discovery could help identify victims and explain what had happened. The farm became a massive crime scene. Areas that once appeared ordinary were now examined through a completely different lens. Buildings, vehículos, ground areas, personal items. Everything became part of a search for answers. The work was slow and emotionally exhausting. Investigators were not only searching for evidence of crimes, they were searching for pieces of people's lives. A piece of clothing, a personal belonging, a trace of DNA. Each discovery carried the weight of a person who had once lived. The investigation forced authorities to confront a horrifying possibility that many of the women who had disappeared over the years may have all been connected to the same place. The families of the missing women followed the investigation with a mixture of hope and fear. For years, many had lived with uncertainty. They wondered if their loved ones were still alive. They wondered if they might return someday. Now, the possibility of finding answers came with another unbearable possibility. The answers might be devastating. Knowing what happened can sometimes hurt more than not knowing, because uncertainty allows a person to hold on to hope. Truth forces them to face reality. As investigators continued searching, the evidence became increasingly connected to the missing women. The names that had once existed separately began to form a single tragic story. Georgina Papin, Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda and Wolf, Marnie Fry. Their stories were no longer separate missing person cases. They became part of a larger investigation. The discovery of evidence at the farm also raised serious questions about the years before the investigation began. How had so many women disappeared without the connection being identified earlier? Why had the pattern remained hidden for so long? Why did it take years before the possibility of a serial predator was fully recognized? These questions would follow the case for years. The investigation was not only about what happened on the farm, it was also about what happened before police arrived there. The women who disappeared had often lived on the margins of society. Many struggled with addiction. Many faced homelessness. Many had experienced trauma. And because of those circumstances, their disappearances did not always receive the immediate attention that families believed they deserved. For many people connected to the victims, the investigation revealed a painful reality. The system had failed to protect some of the most vulnerable people in the community. The search of the Picton property became one of the largest forensic operations in Canadian history. Experts spent months examining the land. The process was complicated by the size of the property and the difficulty of recovering evidence after so much time had passed. Investigators knew that every answer mattered. Every discovery could give a family something they had been waiting years to receive. A name, a confirmation, a sense of closure. But closure is a complicated word. For families who lose someone through violence, justice does not bring their loved one back. A conviction does not erase memories. A courtroom decision does not undo years of pain. Still, knowing the truth matters. Because every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves answers. And every victim deserves to be remembered. As investigators continued their work, Robert Picton became the focus of the investigation. The man who had lived quietly on the farm was now accused of being connected to one of the largest serial murder investigations Canada had ever seen. The world began looking at the same property that had once seemed ordinary and asking how something so horrific could have remained hidden there for so long. The answer would come through years of investigation, forensic analysis, and a long legal battle. But the first major discovery had already changed everything. The silence surrounding the missing women had finally been broken. Their names were being heard. Their stories were being investigated. And the search for justice had begun. Fan 6, the investigation. After the discovery of evidence at the Picton farm, the investigation entered a new and terrifying chapter. What began as a search connected to weapons had transformed into a complex homicide investigation involving dozens of missing women and a suspect who had lived quietly for years. Investigators now faced a massive question. How many victims were there? The answer was not simple. The disappearances had happened over many years. Evidence had to be carefully examined. Timelines had to be reconstructed. Witnesses had to be interviewed. Every detail mattered. The investigators were not only trying to prove what happened, they were trying to rebuild the lives of women who had disappeared. Each missing person file represented a story, a family, a history, a person who had once walked through the world with hopes and fears like everyone else. The investigation team knew that finding the truth would require patience. The Picton property became the center of their work. The land was examined piece by piece. Forensic specialists searched through areas that had previously seemed ordinary. A farm is usually a place associated with work, routine, and daily life. But now every structure, every object, and every corner of the property carried the possibility of revealing something hidden. The investigation became one of the largest forensic operations in Canadian history. Experts worked through difficult conditions, carefully collecting evidence and analyzing anything that could connect the farm to the missing women. The challenge was enormous. Time had passed. The property was large, and investigators had to separate ordinary farm activity from evidence of crimes. Every discovery created new questions. Every answer led to another mystery. At the same time, detectives began examining the life of Robert Picton. They wanted to understand who he was, how he lived, who knew him, and whether anyone had noticed signs that something was wrong. To many people in the community, Picton had seemed unusual but not dangerous. He was quiet. He was isolated. He was not the type of person who attracted constant attention. He lived a life that appeared ordinary on the surface. But investigators began looking beyond appearances. They examined his relationships, his movements, his connections to the downtown east side. They interviewed people who had crossed paths with him over the years. Slowly, a picture began to form. A picture of a man who had access to vulnerable women and a location where those women could disappear without immediate explanation. The investigation also returned to the earlier incidents involving Picton. One of the most important was the 1997 assault involving Wendy Lynn Eisteter. She had survived an encounter at the farm and reported what happened. Police had been given a warning years before the major investigation began. But at the time, the full extent of what might have been happening was not known. Looking back, investigators and critics questioned whether that earlier incident could have revealed more, whether the signs had been there, whether more could have been done. These questions became a painful part of the larger discussion surrounding the case. As detectives continued their work, they also faced the challenge of identifying victims. The evidence recovered from the property had to be matched with missing women. Families waited for information. Some hoped for answers. Others feared what those answers might reveal. The investigation was emotionally difficult not only because of the scale of the crimes, but because of the victims themselves. Many had already experienced hardship during their lives. They had often been ignored while they were alive. Now investigators were fighting to make sure they were not forgotten after death. The police investigation eventually focused on several specific victims whose cases could be supported by available evidence. The names became central to the prosecution: Georgina Papin, Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda and Wolf, Marnie Fry. Behind every name was a separate tragedy, a separate family, a separate story. The investigators understood that the case was not just about numbers. It was about people. As evidence continued to build, prosecutors began preparing for what would become one of the most significant criminal trials in Canadian history. But before a trial could happen, they needed to overcome enormous legal challenges. The defense would question the evidence. They would challenge the investigation. They would argue that the connection between Picton and specific murders had to be proven beyond doubt. The prosecution had to build a case strong enough to convince a jury. The investigation also raised broader questions about society. Why had these women been vulnerable for so long? Why had their disappearances not created a stronger response earlier? Why did it take years before the possibility of a serial offender was fully considered? For the families, these questions were not just part of an investigation. They were personal. They represented years of frustration and pain. Many felt that the system had not treated their loved ones with the urgency they deserved. The investigation forced Canada to look at uncomfortable realities. A person's social status should never determine how much their life matters. A person's struggles should never make them easier to ignore. As detectives continued gathering evidence, Robert Picton remained at the center of the storm. The quiet farmer who had once blended into the community was now accused of committing crimes that shocked the country. But even as the investigation grew, there were still unanswered questions. How many women had entered the farm? How many lives had ended there? How long had the crimes continued? And why had no one stopped him sooner? The investigation would continue for years. Evidence would be analyzed. Witnesses would speak. Experts would examine every detail. The search for justice would move from the fields of Port Coquitlam into the courtroom. But before that happened, investigators had to uncover the full story hidden beneath years of silence. And the deeper they looked, the more disturbing the truth became. Part 7, The Breakthrough. For years, the disappearance of women from Vancouver's downtown east side had remained like a wound that refused to close. Families waited beside silent phones. Friends walked through streets where familiar faces had suddenly vanished. Investigators looked at scattered pieces of information, but the full picture remained hidden behind years of uncertainty, misconnections, and unanswered questions. Then came the moment when the investigation finally began to move toward the truth. The breakthrough did not arrive as a dramatic confession or a single piece of evidence that immediately solved everything. Instead, it came from years of pain, persistence, and the slow realization that all these missing women were not separate stories. They were chapters of the same nightmare. The name Robert Picton had been appearing in the background for years. To some people, he was simply a strange man who lived on a large property in Port Coquitlam, a quiet farmer, someone who kept to himself, someone who rarely invited attention. But behind the walls of his property was a world investigators were only beginning to understand. The Picton farm was not just a piece of land. It was a maze of buildings, vehicles, machinery, and hidden corners. A place where countless objects had been moved, discarded, or buried. a place that would later force investigators to confront one of the most disturbing searches in Canadian criminal history. When police entered the property, they were not just looking for one missing woman. They were searching for answers to a question that had haunted Vancouver for years. Where had all those women gone? The investigation expanded rapidly. What began as a search connected to specific evidence soon became a massive forensic operation. The property was transformed into a crime scene. Every room, every vehicle, every structure became a possible source of evidence. Investigators carefully examined objects that appeared ordinary at first glance. A piece of clothing, a personal belonging, a small item that could connect a missing person to a place where they were never supposed to be found. The work was slow and emotionally exhausting. Forensic specialists searched through soil and examined materials from the property. They knew that somewhere among thousands of details could be the answer families had been waiting for. Each discovery carried a painful possibility. Behind every piece of evidence was a person. A mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. The women whose names appeared in police files were not statistics. They had birthdays. They had favorite songs. They had people who remember their voices and the way they laughed. As investigators continued their search, the evidence against Pickton grew stronger. The farm was connected to missing women through forensic findings, including DNA evidence. Items belonging to some victims were recovered. The possibility that one man could be responsible for so many disappearances became impossible to ignore. The public reaction was a mixture of shock, anger, and grief. Many people asked the same question. How could something like this happen for so long? How could so many women disappear without the alarm being raised sooner? The answer was painful and complicated. Many of the victims lived on the margins of society. They struggled with addiction, poverty, homelessness, and circumstances that often caused them to be overlooked. Their disappearances did not always receive the same urgency that others might have received. Families of the victims had been fighting for years to make people listen. They had insisted that these women mattered, that their lives mattered, that someone needed to search harder. As the investigation continued, Robert Pickton became the center of one of Canada's largest murder investigations. The authorities had to determine not only what happened on the farm, but also how many victims were connected to the property. The scale of the investigation was overwhelming. Hundreds of investigators, forensic experts, and support personnel became involved. The property was examined piece by piece. It was no longer just a farm outside Vancouver. It had become the location where investigators hoped to uncover the truth behind years of unanswered questions. But even with the evidence growing, prosecutors faced an enormous challenge. In criminal cases, suspicion is not enough. A person can be connected to a place. A person can have a disturbing history. A person can appear to be involved. But the court requires proof. Every piece of evidence had to be carefully examined. Every connection had to be established. Every victim's story had to be reconstructed. The investigation was not only about proving that crimes happened. It was about restoring identities to women whose lives had been reduced to missing person reports. Among the victims later chosen for prosecution were Georgina Papine, Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda and Wolf, and Marnie Fry. Each name represented a life interrupted. Each name represented a family that had waited. The investigation revealed the horrifying possibility that Pickton had used the vulnerability of these women against them. Prosecutors argued that he targeted people who he believed would not immediately receive the attention they deserved. It was a chilling realization. The danger was not only the person who committed the crimes. It was also the environment that allowed those crimes to continue unnoticed for so long. As the evidence was gathered, investigators began preparing for the next battle. The courtroom, the place where every discovery would be questioned, where every theory would be challenged, where the voices of the victims and their families would finally be heard. But before that could happen, prosecutors needed to turn years of investigation into a case strong enough to convince a jury. Because behind the walls of the courthouse, behind the legal arguments and evidence presentations, was a much deeper question. Could justice finally be achieved for the women who had disappeared? Could their families finally receive an answer? And could Canada finally understand how one of its darkest criminal cases had been allowed to unfold? The investigation had uncovered the beginning of the truth. But the fight for justice was only beginning. Part 8. The Justice. The courtroom became the place where years of unanswered questions would finally be confronted. After the massive investigation into the Picton farm, after months of forensic examinations, and the discovery of evidence that connected Robert Picton to missing women from Vancouver's downtown east side, the case moved into its most important stage. A trial. But this was never just about one man sitting before a judge and jury. For the families of the victims, this was about finally seeing the women they loved recognized. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. They had wondered what happened. They had waited for phone calls that never came. They had searched through memories, photographs, and old conversations, hoping that somehow the ending would be different. Now, inside the courtroom, their stories were finally being heard. Robert William Picton sat as the accused, facing some of the most serious charges in Canadian criminal history. The prosecution decided to focus on 6 victims: Georgina Papine, Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda and Wolf, and Marnie Fry. The decision was strategic. The investigators believed there were many more victims connected to Picton, but a courtroom requires more than suspicion. Each charge needed evidence that could withstand intense examination. Each victim needed to be connected to the accused beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's argument was built around a disturbing pattern. They said Picton had chosen women who were vulnerable, women who lived difficult lives, women whose disappearances had not immediately triggered the same public urgency that others might have received. According to prosecutors, he understood that these women were often overlooked. And he used that. The trial revealed details about the investigation, the evidence recovered from the farm, and the forensic work that connected Picton to the crimes. The jury was shown how investigators pieced together a case from fragments. A small item, a trace of DNA, a personal possession, a connection that, by itself, might seem insignificant, but together formed a terrifying picture. The defense team challenged the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence did not prove Picton was responsible for the specific murders charged in court. They questioned the reliability of some evidence and attempted to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. The courtroom became a battle between 2 different interpretations. The prosecution presented the image of a calculated predator who had hidden behind a quiet appearance for years. The defense argued that the evidence did not tell the whole story. Throughout the trial, Robert Picton himself remained a figure that fascinated and disturbed the public. To people who knew him casually, he had appeared ordinary. A farmer, a man who lived a simple life, someone who did not fit the image many people expected of a serial killer. But the prosecution argued that this was exactly what made the case so disturbing. The most frightening individuals are not always the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes they blend into everyday life. They work. They speak with neighbors. They appear ordinary. And behind that appearance, something much darker can exist. As the trial continued, the families of the victims carry the emotional weight of watching their loved ones' stories become evidence. For them, the courtroom was not just about legal arguments. It was a place where they had to revisit their deepest pain. Every mention of a victim's name carried years of memories. A daughter, a friend, a mother, a person who had once walked through the world with dreams and hopes. The trial lasted for months. The jury listened carefully to the evidence presented by both sides. They had to separate emotion from facts. They had to examine every piece of information and decide whether the prosecution had proven its case. On December 9, 2007, after considering the evidence, the jury reached a decision. The courtroom waited. The families waited. The accused waited. The verdict was delivered. Robert William Picton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. The decision brought a moment of relief for many families, but it could not erase years of suffering. For those who lost loved ones, justice did not mean that everything was fixed. It did not bring the victims back. It did not remove the memories of years spent searching for answers. It simply meant that the person responsible had been held accountable. Picton was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was the maximum sentence available for second-degree murder under Canadian law at that time. The courtroom had reached its conclusion, but the larger questions surrounding the case remained. Because the Robert Picton investigation was not only about what happened on the farm. It was also about what happened before. How many warnings had been missed? How many families had been ignored? How many women had to disappear before the system recognized the scale of what was happening? The conviction answered one question: who was responsible for the murders proven in court? But it did not answer every question surrounding the tragedy. Years later, investigations and reviews examined how authorities handled reports of missing women from Vancouver's downtown east side. Many families believed the system had failed their loved ones. They argued that these women were not taken seriously enough because of their circumstances, their struggles, and the lives they lived. The case became a painful reminder that every missing person has a story. Every disappearance represents someone who mattered, someone who was loved, someone whose absence left an empty space that could never truly be filled. Robert Pickton became one of Canada's most infamous criminals. But the lasting memory of the case should not only be the name of the man convicted. It should also be the names of the women whose lives were lost. Because long before they became part of a criminal investigation, they were human beings. They had families. They had friendships. They had moments of happiness. They had futures that were taken away. The verdict delivered legal justice. But for many, the search for understanding continued. Why did it happen? How was it allowed to continue? And what could be done to make sure vulnerable people are never ignored in the same way again? Those questions would remain long after the courtroom doors closed. Part 9: The Aftermath. Years after the courtroom fell silent, the name Robert Pickton continued to carry a dark weight in Canadian history. The conviction had closed one chapter, but it did not end the questions, the pain, or the memories left behind by the women whose lives were taken. The story that remained was not only about a man who committed terrible crimes. It was about the people who disappeared. It was about families who spent years searching for answers. It was about a community that had been ignored for far too long. The women connected to the case came from different backgrounds, but they shared one painful reality. Many of them lived in circumstances where society often looked away. They struggled with addiction, poverty, trauma, and instability. Their lives were complicated, but their lives were valuable. They were not just missing persons. They were daughters who had once been held by their mothers. They were friends who had shared jokes and memories. They were women who had dreams, fears, hopes, and moments of happiness. The tragedy of the Pickton case was not only that so many lives were lost. It was that so many people did not realize how much had been lost until it was too late. For the families, the verdict could never truly bring closure. Closure is a word often used after criminal cases, but for those left behind, grief does not disappear because a judge announces a sentence. A mother still wakes up thinking about her child. A sibling still remembers a voice. A friend still wonders what could have been different. Justice can answer who was responsible, but it cannot return the years stolen from those who waited. The aftermath of the case forced Canada to look at uncomfortable truths. It raised questions about how missing person investigations were handled, especially when the missing people were from vulnerable communities. Why did it take so long? Why were the concerns of families not treated with greater urgency? Why did the disappearances of so many women fail to create an immediate emergency? These questions led to broader discussions about policing, social inequality, and the way society values certain lives over others. Many believe the women from Vancouver's downtown east side have been failed not only by one individual, but by a system that did not protect them. Their stories became a call for change. The case also changed how many people view the idea of a victim. A person's struggles do not make them less worthy of protection. A person's mistakes do not make their disappearance less important. A person's circumstances do not erase their humanity. The women connected to the Pickton investigation were not defined by the hardest moments of their lives. They were defined by the fact that they existed. They mattered. They were loved. The years after the trial brought continued reflection. Investigations examined the failures surrounding the case. Families continued to speak about their experiences. Advocates pushed for better support and greater attention for missing and vulnerable people. The story became a warning, not only about the actions of one criminal, but about the danger of ignoring people who society considers invisible. Because silence can protect the wrong people, and silence can leave victims unheard. Robert Pickton remained in prison for the rest of his life. In 2024, he died after an attack while incarcerated. His death did not erase the crimes connected to his name. It did not change what happened. It did not remove the questions that remained. The final image of this case is not the prison cell. It is not the courtroom. It is not the name of the person convicted. The final image belongs to the women, to their memories, to the people who loved them, to the families who carry their names long after the headlines disappeared. The darkest part of the story was not only what happened on a farm outside Vancouver. It was the realization that tragedy had been unfolding quietly, hidden in plain sight. The disappearances began one by one. A woman did not come home. A family started searching. A question remained unanswered. Then another woman disappeared, and another, until the silence became impossible to ignore. The story of Robert Pickton remains one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Canada because it forces society to confront something uncomfortable. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary appearances. Sometimes it exists in places people pass every day without noticing. But the memory that should survive is not the darkness. It is the reminder that every person deserves to be seen. Every missing person deserves to be searched for. Every victim deserves to be remembered. The women whose lives were taken were more than names in a case file. They were human beings. And their stories continue to remind us that justice is not only about finding the person responsible. It is also about listening sooner, caring sooner, and refusing to allow anyone to disappear into silence again. Part 10. The Shadow That Remained. The Robert Pickton case ended in a courtroom, but the impact of what happened continued far beyond the walls of that building. Some cases disappear from public attention after a verdict is announced. The headlines fade, the cameras leave, the world moves on. But this was not one of those cases. The story of the women who vanished from Vancouver's downtown east side remained alive because their absence created a question that could never be ignored. How many people had been forgotten before anyone realized they were gone? For the families of the victims, the years after the trial were filled with a complicated mixture of emotions. There was relief that the truth had finally reached a courtroom. There was anger over the time it took to get there. And there was grief that no verdict could ever remove. A conviction could say that someone was responsible. It could put a criminal behind bars, but it could not undo the empty chairs at family gatherings. It could not erase birthdays that passed without a phone call. It could not bring back the ordinary moments that families miss the most. A laugh, a conversation, a simple goodbye. Those were the things taken away. The women connected to the case became symbols in the public conversation, but for their families, they were never symbols. They were real people. They had favorite foods. They had personalities. They had habits that only the people closest to them knew. They had stories that existed long before their names appeared in police records. One of the greatest tragedies of the case was that the world learned about these women because of how they died, rather than because of how they lived. Their lives deserved attention before the tragedy. Their voices deserved to be heard before they became part of an investigation. The aftermath of the Pickton case forced many Canadians to confront the uncomfortable reality that some victims are easier for society to ignore than others. The women of the downtown east side often faced challenges that placed them on the edge of public attention. Many struggled with addiction. Many experienced homelessness. Many carried trauma from difficult lives. But those struggles never made them less human. Their circumstances never made them less worthy of protection. Their disappearances should have mattered from the beginning. The case became a painful lesson about the importance of listening. Listening when families say something is wrong. Listening when communities raise concerns. Listening when vulnerable people disappear. Because sometimes the first warning signs do not come from official reports. They come from someone who knows a person is missing. Someone who notices that a familiar face is no longer there. Someone who refuses to believe that a disappearance does not matter. Over time, the Pickton case became part of a larger discussion about justice and equality. It raised questions about whether every victim receives the same urgency, whether every family receives the same attention, whether society protects only the people it considers important enough. Those questions were difficult, but necessary, because preventing future tragedies requires more than catching criminals. It requires recognizing warning signs. It requires valuing every life. It requires understanding that vulnerability should never become an invitation for exploitation. The investigation also changed the way many people looked at the role of law enforcement and public institutions. Mistakes were examined. Decisions were questioned. The failures surrounding the missing women became a subject of deep public criticism. For many families, the pain was not only losing someone they loved. It was feeling that they had to fight to prove that person mattered. That feeling left a lasting wound. Years after the conviction, the name Robert Pickton remained associated with one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. But history should not remember only the person who caused the suffering. It should remember the people who endured it, the mothers who waited, the children who grew up without answers, the friends who carried memories, the advocates who refused to stay silent, the investigators who searched through overwhelming evidence to uncover the truth, and the victims themselves, because every criminal case is ultimately about human lives. Behind every file number is a person. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. Behind every disappearance is someone who is loved. The Pickton case remains disturbing because it represents more than a single criminal act. It represents the danger of looking away, the danger of assuming someone else will notice, the danger of believing that certain people can disappear without consequences. The lesson left behind is simple but powerful. No person should ever be considered invisible. No disappearance should ever be dismissed. No family should ever have to fight alone to prove that their loved one mattered. The story began with silence. Women disappeared quietly. Questions remained unanswered. Families searched for years. But eventually, the silence was broken. The truth came forward. Justice, although incomplete and unable to repair the damage, finally arrived. And the names of those women remain, not because of the tragedy that took them, but because their lives were worth remembering. Long after the courtroom closed and the headlines disappeared, their stories continued to carry a message, a reminder that compassion, attention, and humanity are not luxuries. They are responsibilities. And sometimes, the most important thing society can do is simply refuse to look away. The years after the arrest of Robert William Pickton revealed that the case was never only about one man standing accused of unimaginable crimes. It became a painful examination of how an entire system had failed to see the suffering of dozens of women whose disappearances had been treated as isolated incidents rather than pieces of the same horrifying puzzle. For the families, the trial was not simply about proving guilt. It was about finally forcing the world to acknowledge that their daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends mattered. For years, many of these women had lived on the edges of society, their struggles making them almost invisible to people who should have been searching for them. Their names appeared on missing person reports, their faces were shown in photographs held by desperate relatives, but the urgency that surrounded other missing persons cases was often absent. The investigation into Pickton exposed a painful reality. Many of the women who disappeared from Vancouver's downtown east side were already fighting battles that most people never saw. Addiction, poverty, homelessness, violence, and exploitation shaped their daily lives. Some people looked at their circumstances and assumed they were simply lost. But their families knew something was wrong. They knew their loved ones did not just vanish. They had dreams. They had memories. They had people who loved them. And now, after years of silence, their stories were finally being heard. The courtroom in British Columbia became the place where those forgotten voices returned. Every piece of evidence presented was connected to a person whose life had existed far beyond the moment of their disappearance. Behind every photograph shown to the jury was a woman who had once laughed with friends, celebrated birthdays, made plans, and imagined a future. The prosecution's challenge was enormous. The investigation had uncovered evidence connected to the Pickton property, but proving individual murders beyond a reasonable doubt required carefully rebuilding the stories of specific victims. They focused on 6 women whose cases would become the center of the trial: Georgina Papin, Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda and Wolfe, Marnie Fry. Each name represented a life interrupted. The prosecution argued that Pickton had chosen women who were vulnerable because he believed their disappearances would not immediately trigger the same level of attention. They described a pattern in which women from downtown East Side would enter his world and never return. The defense, however, challenged the evidence. They argued that suspicion was not enough. They questioned whether investigators had correctly interpreted the forensic discoveries and whether the evidence could prove that Pickton himself was responsible for each death. The trial became a battle between two narratives. One side presented a picture of a calculated predator who exploited women society had ignored. The other argued that the evidence did not conclusively prove every accusation. For the families watching, the legal arguments could feel distant from the reality they had lived. They were not thinking about technical details or courtroom strategy. They were thinking about empty bedrooms, unanswered phone calls, and years spent wondering what happened. Many had waited a decade or more for this moment. The emotional weight inside the courtroom was impossible to ignore. As witnesses testified, the victims slowly became more than names in a criminal file. Their personalities, relationships, and struggles were brought back into public view. The women who had disappeared were no longer just statistics from a missing persons investigation. They became human again. The evidence gathered from the Pickton farm was extensive and disturbing. Investigators had spent months searching the property, examining countless items, collecting samples, and trying to understand what had happened behind the walls of a place that appeared ordinary from the outside. The farm had once been a place where neighbors saw animals, machinery, and routine daily activity. But investigators saw something very different. They saw unanswered questions buried in the soil. They saw traces of lives that had been cut short. They saw the remains of a mystery that had haunted Vancouver for years. The forensic teams faced an enormous task. A crime scene of that size was unlike anything many investigators had experienced. Every section of the property had to be carefully examined. Every discovery had to be documented. Every possible piece of evidence had to be preserved. The work was slow and emotionally exhausting. The investigators were not simply collecting objects. They were searching for answers. They were searching for names. They were searching for a way to return some sense of justice to families who had been waiting in uncertainty. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence that linked Pickton to the victims. DNA analysis and forensic findings became central parts of the case. The scientific evidence created a connection between the farm and women who had disappeared years earlier. For the jury, the question was not whether something terrible had happened. That was already clear. The question was whether the evidence proved that Robert Pickton was responsible beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution carefully built their argument, showing how different pieces of evidence connected together. They described a pattern of behavior, a location where multiple missing women were connected, and physical evidence that pointed toward Pickton's involvement. The defense continued to challenge the reliability and interpretation of that evidence. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof was on the prosecution. Months passed. The trial continued. For the families, every day brought them closer to an answer they had waited years to receive. But even if there was a conviction, many knew that nothing could restore what they had lost. No verdict could bring their loved ones back. No sentence could erase the years of pain. The trial also forced Canada to confront uncomfortable questions about how society treated vulnerable women. The disappearance of women from downtown East Side had not received the immediate national attention many believed it deserved. The case raised questions about whether the victims had been ignored because of their backgrounds. Would the investigation have moved faster if these women had lived different lives? Would authorities have responded differently if they had come from wealthier neighborhoods? These questions became part of the larger conversation surrounding the case. The tragedy was not only that a dangerous individual existed. The tragedy was that so many warning signs were missed. The women had been disappearing for years. Families had been asking questions. Community members had raised concerns. Yet the full scale of the horror remained hidden. The Pickton investigation became a painful reminder that every missing person deserves attention, regardless of their circumstances. A person's struggles do not make their life less valuable. A person's mistakes do not make their disappearance less important. Behind every missing person report is a human being. A person who had a childhood. A person who had hopes. A person who was loved. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the world waited for the jury's decision. The evidence had been presented. The arguments had been made. Now the fate of Robert Pickton rested in the hands of 12 people who had listened to months of testimony about one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Canadian history. For the families, the waiting was unbearable. They had already waited years. They had waited through uncertainty. They had waited through unanswered questions. They had waited while the world slowly learned the names of the women they had never stopped searching for. And finally, the moment arrived. The jury returned. The courtroom became silent. The decision would determine whether the man accused of taking their loved ones away would be held responsible. In 2007, Robert William Pickton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict brought a mixture of emotions. There was relief. There was sadness. There was anger. There was also the understanding that justice, while necessary, could never fully repair the damage left behind. Pickton received a life sentence, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum punishment available for second-degree murder in Canada at that time. For many, the conviction represented an important acknowledgement. The women were finally recognized. Their disappearances were finally understood as part of something much larger. Their lives had mattered, but the questions surrounding the case did not disappear with the verdict. Many people continued to ask how such a crime could continue for so long. How could so many women disappear without immediate action? How could a person accused of such horrific crimes remain hidden for years? And perhaps the most painful question of all, could more have been done to protect them? The legacy of the Pickton case would continue long after the courtroom doors closed. It became a symbol of the dangers faced by marginalized communities and the consequences of ignoring people who are already struggling. The women lost in this tragedy were not defined by the circumstances of their lives. They were not simply victims. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, and human beings whose stories deserve to be remembered. Their lives existed before their names appeared in a criminal investigation. They had voices before the world finally listened, and their stories became a reminder that justice begins long before a courtroom. It begins with seeing people. It begins with believing them. It begins with understanding that every life has value, even when society chooses not to look. The shadow of Robert Pickton remains one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. But beyond the horror of what happened, the most important part of this story will always belong to the women whose lives were taken. Because they were never just missing names on a list. They were people who were here, people who mattered, and people whose memories continue to demand that they are never forgotten. The years following the conviction of Robert William Pickton did not bring a simple ending to one of Canada's most disturbing criminal cases. A verdict had been delivered, a sentence had been handed down, a man responsible for unimaginable suffering had been placed behind bars. But for the families of the women who disappeared, the story did not end when the courtroom emptied. For them, justice was not a single moment. It was a lifetime of learning how to live with what could never be repaired. The conviction answered one question that had haunted investigators for years: who was responsible for the deaths connected to the Pickton farm? But it left behind another, much larger question that continued to echo across Vancouver and beyond. How had this been allowed to happen for so long? The answer was not found in one mistake or one missed opportunity. Instead, it was hidden inside years of broken communication, assumptions, and a failure to recognize the urgency behind the disappearances of vulnerable women. After the trial, attention turned toward the way authorities had handled the missing women cases before Pickton's arrest. Families who had spent years searching for answers wanted to understand why their concerns had not led to faster action. They remembered the phone calls. They remembered reporting their loved ones missing. They remembered showing photographs, explaining details, repeating the same information again and again. And they remembered the feeling that nobody was listening. The tragedy was not only what happened on the farm in Port Coquitlam. The tragedy was also everything that happened before. The years when women disappeared one by one. The years when families waited. The years when a pattern slowly formed, but no one saw the full picture. The downtown East Side community had known for a long time that something was wrong. People who lived and worked in the area noticed women disappearing. Friends noticed empty spaces where familiar faces used to be. Community members spoke about their fears. But many of these women were living lives that society often ignored. They struggled with addiction. They faced poverty. Some worked in dangerous environments. Some had complicated relationships with their families. Their circumstances made them easier to overlook, and that became one of the most painful lessons of the entire case. A missing person is not less important because their life is difficult. A disappearance is not less urgent because someone is vulnerable. The women connected to the Picton investigation had stories that existed long before tragedy found them. They had childhood memories. They had favorite songs. They had people who cared about them. They had moments of happiness that the world rarely saw. After the trial, many families continued the difficult process of remembering their loved ones beyond the crime. They spoke about who these women really were. Not just the details of how they disappeared, not just the evidence presented in court, but the people they had been, the laughter they shared, the kindness they showed, the small details that made them unique. Because when someone becomes part of a criminal investigation, there is always a danger that their identity becomes reduced to a case number. The families fought against that. They wanted the world to remember that these women were more than victims. They were human beings. The case also changed the way Canada viewed missing and murdered Indigenous and vulnerable women. Although the Picton victims came from different backgrounds, the investigation became part of a much broader national conversation about how marginalized women are treated and protected. It forced many people to confront uncomfortable realities. Some lives receive immediate attention when they disappear. Others do not. Some families are believed quickly. Others must fight to make people care. The story of the missing women became a symbol of why every disappearance deserves serious attention from the beginning. The investigation also transformed the way law enforcement approached large-scale missing persons cases. The challenges investigators faced at the Picton farm were extraordinary. Searching such a large property, identifying victims, and connecting evidence from years of alleged crimes required enormous resources and cooperation between different agencies. The forensic examination became one of the most complex in Canadian history. Every discovery carried emotional weight. Behind every piece of evidence was the possibility of answering a family's question. What happened? Where was she? Could she finally come home? The investigators were not simply processing a crime scene. They were working inside the remains of shattered lives. The farm itself became a symbol of hidden darkness. From the outside, it was an ordinary property, a place that appeared disconnected from the chaos of Vancouver streets. But inside that ordinary-looking environment, investigators uncovered evidence of extraordinary horror. That contrast became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. How could something so terrible exist in a place that seemed so normal? How could a man live among neighbors, interact with people, and maintain an appearance of ordinary life while investigators later connected him to one of the largest serial murder investigations in Canadian history? Those questions remained part of the public fascination with the case. But for the families, the focus was different. They were not interested in the mystery of Robert Picton. They were interested in the women. They wanted their names spoken. They wanted their memories protected. They wanted their lives to be remembered beyond the violence that ended them. Years after the conviction, the story continued to evolve. New discussions emerged about accountability, police response, and social responsibility. Independent reviews examined what went wrong and what lessons needed to be learned. The goal was not only to understand the past, it was to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Because the most important question was not simply how one person committed such terrible acts. The more important question was how society could become better at protecting people before they become victims. Robert Picton remained in prison, but the impact of the case extended far beyond his sentence. His name became associated with one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. Yet his name was never the most important part of the story. The most important names belonged to the women whose lives were taken. Women whose families waited. Women whose stories deserved attention. Women who should have been seen. The passage of time did not erase the pain. Birthdays still came. Anniversaries still arrived. Memories still surfaced unexpectedly. A photograph. A song. A familiar place. Small reminders of people who were gone but never forgotten. For the families, healing did not mean forgetting. It meant carrying the memory forward. It meant telling the world that their loved ones mattered. The case of Robert Picton remains a warning about what can happen when vulnerable people are ignored. It reminds society that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary routines, familiar faces, and places that seem harmless. And sometimes the first sign of a tragedy is not a dramatic moment. It is silence. The silence of unanswered questions. The silence of ignored warnings. the silence surrounding people who desperately need someone to notice. The women lost in this case cannot be brought back. No conviction can change that. No prison sentence can undo the pain. But remembering them ensures that their lives are not defined only by the tragedy they experienced. They were mothers, daughters, friends, sisters, people with hopes and dreams, people who existed, people who mattered, and their story continues to remind the world of a simple but powerful truth. Every person deserves to be seen. Every disappearance deserves to be investigated. Every life deserves to be valued. Because behind every missing name is a story, and every story deserves to be heard. After the conviction of Robert William Pickton, the world outside Canada continued to look back at the case with shock and disbelief. To many people, the story seemed almost impossible to comprehend. A man living on a farm, surrounded by ordinary routines and familiar faces, had become connected to one of the largest and most disturbing criminal investigations in the country's history. But for those who had lived through it, the case was never a story about a mysterious criminal. It was a story about absence. It was about the empty chairs at family gatherings, the unanswered messages, the photographs kept in drawers because looking at them hurt too much, but putting them away felt like losing the person all over again. For years, families of the missing women carried a burden that few people outside their world could understand. They lived between hope and grief. They wondered whether the next phone call would bring good news or confirmation of their worst fears. Some continued believing their loved ones might return. Some held on to small possibilities. Maybe she was somewhere else. Maybe she needed help. Maybe tomorrow would be the day they found her. But as the years passed, hope became heavier to carry. The discovery of the Pickton investigation forced many families to face a reality they had feared but never wanted to accept. The women they had searched for were not coming home. The pain of that realization was impossible to measure. For the families, the trial was not just about punishment. It was about recognition. Recognition that their loved ones mattered. Recognition that their disappearances should have been treated differently. Recognition that their voices should have been heard much earlier. The case created a national conversation about how society views people living on the margins. It challenged the idea that someone's struggles make them less worthy of protection. Many of the women connected to the investigation had faced difficult circumstances. Some battled addiction. Some experienced homelessness. Some survived violence and exploitation. Their lives were complicated, but their value is not. A person's hardest moments do not erase who they are. A person's mistakes do not make them disposable. The tragedy of the Pickton case revealed what can happen when a vulnerable community is ignored for too long. The downtown East Side was not just a location on a map. It was a neighborhood filled with people. People with stories. People with families. People trying to survive. Many residents had warned that something was wrong. They had noticed women disappearing. They had spoken about their fears. They had seen patterns forming. But those concerns did not receive the attention many believed they deserved. The case became a painful example of how missing persons investigations can be influenced by assumptions about who deserves urgency. The women who vanished were not strangers without connections. They had people searching for them. They had people waiting. They had people who loved them. The aftermath of the investigation also changed the way many Canadians viewed the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Trust had been damaged. Some people felt abandoned by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. The families wanted answers not only about what happened to their loved ones, but also about why action had taken so long. Those questions would continue for years. Could more women have been saved? Could earlier intervention have changed the outcome? Were warning signs ignored because of who the victims were? These were difficult questions, but they were necessary ones. Because understanding a tragedy is not only about looking at the person who committed the crime. It is also about examining the environment that allowed the crime to continue. Robert Pickton did not operate in a vacuum. He existed in a world where certain people were easier to overlook, and that reality became one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. The investigation changed many lives, including the investigators themselves. Those who worked on the case carried the weight of what they discovered. Searching the farm, examining evidence, and reconstructing the stories of missing women was not just a professional assignment. It was an emotional experience. Every piece of evidence represented a person, Every discovery represented a family waiting for answers. The work required patience, precision, and emotional strength. The investigators knew that behind every name was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. The scale of the investigation was overwhelming. The property became a massive forensic operation. Specialists from different fields worked together to analyze evidence and establish what had happened. But even the most advanced technology could not answer the deepest emotional questions. Why her? Why then? Why did nobody stop it sooner? Those questions belonged to the families. And those questions could not be solved in a laboratory. Years after the trial, the name Robert Pickton continued to appear in discussions about criminal justice, missing persons cases, and social responsibility. But as time passed, many people began focusing less on the man convicted and more on the women whose lives were lost. That shift mattered, because criminals often become the center of attention. Their names become famous, their actions become analyzed, their stories become repeated, but the victims risk becoming forgotten. The families fought against that. They wanted people to remember the women as they truly were, not as headlines, not as evidence, not as names attached to a tragedy, but as human beings. The legacy of the case became a reminder that remembering victims is an important part of justice. A courtroom can decide guilt, a judge can decide punishment, but memory belongs to everyone. It belongs to the communities that lost people. It belongs to the families who continue carrying grief. It belongs to a society that must learn from what happened. The women connected to the Pickton case left behind more than the circumstances of their deaths. They left behind memories, friendships, family bonds, moments that existed before the tragedy. Their lives were not defined by the worst thing that happened to them. They were defined by everything that came before. The childhood memories, the conversations, the dreams, the ordinary moments that make every person unique. The case also became a warning about silence, because silence can protect the wrong people. Silence can allow suffering to continue. Silence can make victims feel invisible. The disappearance of these women was not something that happened suddenly in one moment. It developed over time. One missing person, one unanswered question, one family searching, one community asking for help. And for years, those voices struggled to break through. The story of Robert Pickton remains disturbing not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of what the case revealed about society. It showed the danger of looking away. It showed the consequences of underestimating vulnerable people. It showed why every missing person deserves attention. Every family deserves answers. Every victim deserves to be remembered. The final chapter of this case is not about a killer. It is about the people who were lost. It is about the families who continued fighting. It is about a community that demanded to be heard. And it is about a lesson that remains important long after the headlines disappear. No one should have to disappear before the world decides they mattered. No one should have to become a victim before people listen. Because every person has a story, and every story deserves to be told. The story of Robert William Pickton did not truly end when the courtroom delivered its verdict. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but the emotional aftermath continued for everyone connected to the case. For the families, there was no final chapter. There was only life after loss. A life where birthdays arrived without the person they were supposed to celebrate. A life where old photographs became both comforting and painful. A life where memories became the only way to remain connected to someone who could never return. The families of the victims carried a unique kind of grief. It was not only the pain of losing someone they loved. It was also the pain of knowing that the world had taken too long to recognize their suffering. Many had spent years searching, years asking questions, years hoping. The investigation eventually gave them answers, but those answers came with a devastating price. For many families, the hardest moment was accepting that the person they had been waiting for was gone. There is a special kind of pain in uncertainty. When someone disappears, the mind searches for possibilities. It creates scenarios. It holds on to hope because hope feels easier than accepting an unbearable reality. Maybe she is alive. Maybe she will come home. Maybe there is still a chance. The discovery connected to the Pickton farm destroyed that possibility for many families. But even in grief, they continued to fight for something important. They fought for recognition. They fought for respect. They fought so that the women they loved would never be reduced to a criminal case file. The aftermath of the Picton investigation became a reflection of a larger problem. The case exposed the ways vulnerable communities can be ignored when society decides some people are less visible than others. Many of the women who disappeared lived difficult lives, but their struggles did not define their worth. They were not only the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. They were people with histories, people with personalities, people who had once been children, people who had once imagined futures. The tragedy was that many people learned their names only after they were gone. That reality became one of the most painful lessons of the case. A person should not have to become a victim before the world decides their life matters. The investigation also changed the conversation about missing persons. It challenged old assumptions. It forced authorities, communities, and the public to reconsider how cases involving vulnerable people are handled. Because when someone disappears, the circumstances of their life should not determine the urgency of the search. A missing person is not a statistic. A missing person is someone's loved one, someone's family, someone's friend. The women connected to the Picton case became part of a national discussion about justice, accountability, and compassion. Their stories influence conversations about how communities respond when people are at risk. They reminded people that behind every missing person poster is a human story. A mother who misses her child, a sibling who wants answers, a friend who remembers the person before tragedy, a community that refuses to forget. The case also left a lasting impact on investigators who worked through the evidence. The scale of the investigation was unlike anything many had experienced. The property required countless hours of searching and analysis. The evidence was complex. The emotional weight was enormous. Investigators were not simply solving a crime. They were attempting to reconstruct the final moments of people whose lives had already been taken away. Every discovery carried meaning. Every piece of evidence represented a person. Every name represented a family waiting. The work required determination because the victims deserved answers. But answers do not erase pain. Justice and healing are not the same thing. A conviction can hold someone accountable. A sentence can acknowledge wrongdoing. But neither can restore the lives that were lost. That is something every family connected to the case understood. They did not want revenge. They wanted the world to understand. They wanted people to see the women behind the headlines. They wanted their loved ones remembered for who they were, not only for how they died. Over time, memorials, discussions, and community efforts helped preserve their memories. The focus slowly shifted from the person responsible to the people who were taken. That shift was important, because one of the greatest dangers after a crime of this magnitude is allowing the victim to disappear a second time. The first disappearance is physical. The second happens when people stop remembering. The families refused to allow that. They continued speaking. They continued sharing memories. They continued reminding others that these women existed. They laughed. They loved. They had dreams. They had moments of happiness. They had lives before the tragedy. The story of the Picton case also became a reminder that evil does not always appear obvious. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary routines. Sometimes it exists behind a familiar face. Sometimes it remains unnoticed because people are looking in the wrong places. That is what made the case so disturbing. The idea that something so horrific could exist for so long without being fully recognized. But the lesson is not only about one person. It is about awareness. It is about listening when people raise concerns. It is about believing families when they say something is wrong. It is about understanding that every person deserves protection. The years after the trial brought continued reflection on the failures surrounding the investigation. People examined what could have been done differently. They questioned decisions. They looked at patterns that had been missed. They searched for ways to make sure future victims would not be ignored. Because the purpose of remembering a tragedy is not only to mourn. It is also to learn. It is to create change. The name Robert Picton remains associated with one of the darkest criminal cases in Canadian history. But the final message of this story should not belong to him. It should belong to the women who were lost, the women whose names must continue to be spoken, the women whose lives were more than the tragedy that ended them. Their stories remind us that every person leaves behind something, a memory, a connection, a piece of the world that exists because they were here. The true measure of justice is not only whether a criminal is punished, it is whether society learns to value people before it is too late. The case of Robert Pickton left behind pain that will never completely disappear. But it also left behind a responsibility to notice, a responsibility to listen, a responsibility to remember. Because silence allowed suffering to continue, and remembrance is one way to ensure that those voices are never lost again. The women who disappeared from Vancouver's downtown east side were never invisible. The world simply failed to look closely enough, and their story continues to remind us that every life matters. Years after the name Robert William Pickton became associated with one of the darkest criminal investigations in Canadian history, the story continued to live on, not because of the man who committed the crimes, but because of the lives that were taken and the questions that remained unanswered. The passage of time did not erase the pain. For the families of the missing women, there was never a moment when the case truly ended. A courtroom verdict could establish guilt. A prison sentence could hold a person accountable. But nothing could restore the years they lost searching, wondering, hoping, and waiting for someone to finally admit that their loved ones mattered. The women whose names became connected to the Pickton investigation were often introduced through the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. Their struggles, their addictions, their hardships, and their vulnerabilities were discussed repeatedly. But behind every police file, behind every photograph pinned to an investigation board, there was a person who had once laughed, dreamed, loved, and been loved. They were daughters. They were mothers. They were sisters. They were friends. Long before their names appeared in headlines, they were ordinary people trying to survive in a world that had already pushed many of them to the edges. The tragedy of the case was not only that a predator found opportunities among vulnerable women. It was also that their disappearances did not immediately create the urgency that many believe should have existed. Families came forward with concerns. People in the community noticed patterns. Friends wondered why certain women stopped appearing in familiar places. But for years, the disappearances seemed disconnected, treated as separate incidents rather than pieces of a much larger and more terrifying picture. The downtown east side of Vancouver became a place where those questions echoed. It was a neighborhood filled with contradictions. It had a long history, a strong community spirit, and people who looked after one another. But it was also an area where poverty, addiction, homelessness, and social struggles were visible every day. Many of the women who disappeared lived lives that were already filled with challenges. Some were battling addiction. Some had experienced trauma. Some had lost connections with family. Some were trying to rebuild themselves after years of hardship. And because of those circumstances, their absence was sometimes overlooked. That reality became one of the most painful parts of the aftermath. The case forced Canada to confront an uncomfortable question. Would the investigation have moved faster if these women had come from different backgrounds? Would more people have listened sooner if their lives looked different? Would their names have received the same attention if they lived in safer neighborhoods, had different careers, or belonged to different social circles? These questions did not disappear after the trial. They remained. They became part of a larger conversation about how society values certain lives and how easily others can become invisible. For investigators, the Pickton case represented a massive challenge. The crime scene was unlike anything many had ever encountered. A large farm property had to be examined piece by piece. Every object, every fragment, every possible trace had to be carefully analyzed. The investigation required patience. It required thousands of hours of work. It required forensic teams to search through a place where evidence had been exposed to time, weather, and the complexity of a working farm environment. But beyond the evidence, there was another responsibility. Every discovery represented a person. Every piece of identification represented a family waiting for answers. For investigators, the work was not simply about proving a crime had happened. It was about giving names back to people who had been missing. The conviction of Robert Pickton brought a form of justice, but it also revealed the limits of justice. A sentence could punish the offender. A verdict could confirm what happened. But justice could not undo the years of uncertainty experienced by families. It could not erase the image of a loved one disappearing without explanation. It could not remove the pain of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that passed without someone who should have been there. For some families, the hardest part was not only losing someone, It was losing them slowly, first through unanswered phone calls, then through missing person reports, then through years of waiting, then through the painful realization that the person they loved was never coming home. The story of Robert Pickton also raised questions about how a crime of such scale could continue for so long. How could someone living an apparently ordinary life hide something so horrific? How could neighbors, acquaintances, and people around him not see what was happening? The answer is complicated. People often imagine dangerous individuals as obvious monsters. They expect someone who commits terrible crimes to look terrifying, to behave in a way that immediately reveals their intentions. But history has repeatedly shown that reality is different. Some predators hide behind ordinary appearances. They go to work. They speak with neighbors. They perform normal routines. They create an image that allows others to underestimate them. And that image can become the very thing that protects them. In Pickton's case, the contrast between the public perception of him and the allegations against him became one of the most disturbing elements of the investigation. A quiet man from a farm. A person who blended into the background. A figure many people would never have imagined capable of committing such crimes. Yet behind that ordinary appearance was a series of actions that left a permanent scar on countless families and communities. The case also changed the way missing persons investigations were viewed in Canada. It highlighted the importance of taking every disappearance seriously, regardless of a person's background or circumstances. Because vulnerability should never determine whether someone deserves to be searched for. Every missing person represents someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. Every disappearance carries a story, and every unanswered disappearance leaves behind people who continue searching. In the years following the trial, memorials and remembrance efforts continued to honor the women whose lives were lost. Flowers were placed, names were spoken, stories were shared, because remembering became a way of resisting the silence that surrounded them for so long. Their lives were more than the tragedy that happened to them. They were more than evidence in a criminal case. They were human beings whose existence mattered before the investigation ever began. And perhaps that is the most important lesson left behind by this case. The darkest crimes are not only about the people who commit them. They are also about the people who are forgotten. The people whose voices are not heard quickly enough. The people who disappear into the background until someone finally realizes they were missing all along. The legacy of the Pickton case is not simply the story of a criminal. It is the story of a community forced to look at its own failures. It is the story of families who refuse to stop asking questions. It is the story of women whose lives deserved attention, compassion, and protection. And it is a reminder that behind every headline, behind every investigation file, behind every name mentioned in a courtroom, there is a person who once had a future that should have continued, a future that was taken away, and a memory that must never be forgotten. The story of Robert Pickton did not end when the courtroom doors closed. In many ways, that was only the beginning of a much larger conversation about justice, accountability, and the responsibility a society has toward those who are most vulnerable. For the families of the women who disappeared, the years after the trial carried a complicated mixture of emotions. There was relief that the truth had finally been acknowledged. There was anger over the years that passed before answers came. There was grief that no verdict could ever truly heal. A courtroom can decide guilt. It can establish facts. It can place responsibility on one person. But it cannot return a mother to her children. It cannot bring back a sister who was expected to walk through the door again. It cannot erase the memories of families who spent years wondering whether they would ever know what happened. For many relatives, the hardest part was remembering the person before the tragedy. Because the women lost in the Pickton case were often defined by the way they died. But their families remembered how they lived. They remembered smiles. They remembered voices. They remembered small habits and personal moments that never appeared in police reports. A woman who loved music. A woman who cared deeply about her family. A woman who made people laugh. A woman who had dreams that never had the chance to become reality. Those memories became a form of resistance against being reduced to a case number. The victims were not simply names connected to one of Canada's most infamous criminal investigations. They were human beings whose lives had meaning long before anyone knew their names. The aftermath of the case also forced a deeper examination of how institutions respond when people disappear. The independent reviews that followed looked at the actions of law enforcement and examined whether warning signs had been missed. For many people, the question was painful but necessary. Could more have been done? Could the women have been found sooner? Could earlier attention have prevented more deaths? These questions were not asked because people wanted simple answers. They were asked because behind every unanswered question was another family that had suffered. The case revealed a difficult reality about missing persons investigations. A disappearance does not exist in isolation. Patterns matter. Connections matter. And every report deserves attention, no matter who the missing person is. The women from Vancouver's downtown east side were living in circumstances that made them vulnerable, but vulnerability should never mean invisibility. That became one of the strongest messages that emerged after the investigation. A person's struggles do not make their life less valuable. A person's mistakes do not make them less deserving of protection. A person's background should never determine how seriously their disappearance is taken. The tragedy of the Picton case also changed the way many people viewed the relationship between society and marginalized communities. For years, some of these women lived on the edge of public attention. They were seen every day by people passing through the city, yet many of their stories remained unknown. The investigation brought those hidden stories into the light. It showed the consequences of ignoring people who are already struggling. It showed how silence can become dangerous, because silence allows problems to grow. Silence allows warning signs to disappear. Silence allows victims to become forgotten. The case became a painful reminder that crime does not only happen in dramatic moments. Sometimes it develops slowly, hidden behind ordinary routines and overlooked details. A missing person report, a concerned friend, a family member asking questions, a community member noticing something unusual. Each moment may seem small, but together, they can become the difference between discovering the truth and losing more time. Years after the conviction, the name Robert Picton remained associated with fear and horror. But the final chapter of this story should not belong to him. Criminals often become famous because of what they did. Their names are repeated. Their actions are studied. Their faces appear in documentaries and news reports. But the danger is that the person who caused the suffering can become more remembered than the people who suffered. That is why remembering the victims matters. Because the true center of this story is not the man who committed the crimes. It is the women whose lives were stolen. It is the families who waited. It is the communities that demanded answers. It is the people who refused to allow those disappearances to remain forgotten. Robert Picton died in 2024 after an attack while serving his sentence, but his death did not close every question surrounding the case. Some mysteries remained. Some families continued carrying pain. Some wounds never fully healed. But the end of one person's life does not erase the importance of the lives that were lost. The impact of the case continues to be felt because it represents something larger than one criminal investigation. It represents a warning about what can happen when vulnerable people are ignored, a warning about the importance of listening, a warning that every person deserves to be seen. The story began with women disappearing quietly. No dramatic moment announced what was happening. No single event immediately revealed the truth. There were only absences, empty spaces, people who stopped showing up, questions that went unanswered. And slowly, those unanswered questions became impossible to ignore. The silence eventually broke. The truth eventually came forward, but the cost was enormous. The Picton case remains one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history, not only because of the crimes committed, but because of the reminder it left behind. Behind every statistic is a person. Behind every missing poster is a family. Behind every investigation file is a life that mattered. And perhaps the most important lesson is also the simplest. The people who are easiest for society to overlook are often the people who most need to be protected. Because every life has value, every story deserves to be heard, and every person deserves to be remembered.